November 1942, somewhere between the Don and the Volga. The battlefield looked less like land and more like a place the earth itself had tried to swallow whole. Snow had turned into a thick mixture of mud and ice. Shell craters were filled with black freezing water. Torn coats, shattered helmets, twisted arms half buried in frozen dirt lay scattered everywhere, as if some giant hand had brushed men aside and walked away without a second thought. Silence covered the field. Only the wind remained, low and endless, carrying the exhausted sound of a world that had seen too much death. And in the middle of that silence, one man was still breathing. His name was Michael Turner, 23 years old, an American volunteer attached to Allied forces on the Eastern Front. Before the war, he worked at an automobile plant outside Pittsburgh and spent Sundays playing baseball with neighborhood kids. He was not a hero. Not a coward either. Just an ordinary man who had somehow ended up in one of the worst places on earth. He lay flat on his back, staring into a gray winter sky. He stayed motionless not because he physically couldn't move, but because moving meant dying. His left leg had been ripped open above the knee by shrapnel. Every attempt to bend it sent a wave of burning pain through his body so intense that his vision darkened. But the wound was not his greatest problem. 40 yards away, he heard footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Measured. German soldiers were moving across the battlefield, checking the bodies. Michael understood immediately. First came the crunch of boots through snow. Then a pause. Then either silence, or a single gunshot. Quick. Efficient. Businesslike. They were finishing off the wounded. He closed his eyes and forced himself to breathe as lightly as possible through his nose. His chest could not rise. His hands had to stay loose. His face had to look empty, lifeless. Before that moment, he had never truly thought about what dead men looked like. Now he studied the idea carefully because his survival depended on it. The footsteps drew closer. Snow cracked beneath boots. Someone spoke in German. Another voice answered with a short laugh, completely indifferent. Then a gunshot exploded nearby. Michael did not react. Fear had changed into something colder. Sharper. Every nerve in his body focused on one command only: don't move. Don't blink. Don't breathe too deeply. The footsteps stopped beside him. A boot nudged his ribs. Not hard. Just enough to test him. Michael remained still. 1 second passed. Then another. The soldiers moved on. Even after they were gone, he stayed frozen for several more minutes before finally swallowing the saliva gathering painfully in his throat. It was a tiny victory, but it meant one thing. He was still alive. To understand how he ended up lying among the dead, you have to go back 6 hours earlier. Their company had been woken before dawn. Captain Harris, a weathered officer in his 40s who spoke quietly even when angry, gathered the men outside a dugout and explained the mission in simple terms: break through the German defensive line near Hill 114, secure the position, and hold it until reinforcements arrived. That was all. Michael remembered standing shoulder to shoulder with the others while snow drifted through the dark morning air. Next to him was Tommy Walker, another American volunteer he'd met months earlier. Tommy muttered under his breath that Hill 114 was nothing more than a frozen mound of dirt and that the Germans probably wouldn't even bother defending it seriously. Tommy was an optimist. Usually it irritated Michael. That morning he was grateful for it. They advanced shortly after sunrise. A thin layer of November snow covered the open ground ahead of them. 400 yards without cover. No trees. No trenches. Only frozen earth and the burned remains of abandoned wagons. The first 100 yards passed quietly. Then the machine guns opened up. Afterward, Michael could never clearly describe what happened next. Memory turned into noise, explosions, screams, smoke, fountains of dirt erupting around him. He ran. Dropped to the ground. Crawled. Got up again. Men beside him disappeared into shell bursts. Someone shouted about the left flank. Another voice screamed for a medic. Then came the explosion that hit him. He didn't hear it. He felt the earth slam upward beneath him like a wall. Something tore into his leg. He crashed into the mud and tried to stand, but the leg collapsed instantly. He tried again. Darkness flooded his vision. So he lay back and stared upward while the battle drifted farther away. Gunfire continued in the distance. Either the company was retreating or being pushed back. He couldn't tell which. Then he heard Tommy calling his name. Tommy was lying a few feet away, alive but badly wounded. Something was horribly wrong with his arm. He looked at Michael and said, "Hang on. Our guys will come back for us." A second later another shell landed nearby. Michael shut his eyes against the shockwave. When he looked again, Tommy was gone. Only part of a coat remained where he had been. And somewhere beyond the smoke, German voices were getting closer. That was the moment Michael understood exactly what he had to do. He couldn't run. Couldn't hide. So he became one of the dead. He rolled onto his back, spread his arms loosely, relaxed every muscle in his face, and stopped moving. 1 hour passed. Then another. German patrols crossed the battlefield methodically, without hurry, like workers performing an unpleasant but familiar task. Michael heard conversations, occasional laughter, even the metallic sound of a can being opened. They were eating only yards away while he lay among corpses pretending he no longer existed. Darkness slowly covered the field. The cold began creeping through his coat. At first it was only discomfort. Then it became something alive. It stole heat from his fingers, his chest, his legs. He could not move to warm himself. He could only lie there and feel his body slowly surrendering warmth to the frozen ground. To survive, he thought about home. His mother's old iron stove back in Pennsylvania. The smell of burning wood. Warm air filling the kitchen during winter mornings. He held on to that memory desperately because it gave him something stronger than the cold. By nightfall, the Germans finally withdrew. Michael listened carefully as the footsteps faded into the darkness. Even then he waited another hour before daring to move a finger. The battlefield had become silent again. He slowly turned his head. Bodies surrounded him everywhere, black shapes scattered across gray snow. No living men remained. At least none he could see. He understood then that rescue was not coming. Maybe not tomorrow either. Perhaps the front line had shifted entirely, leaving this field deep behind enemy positions. But one fact remained. He was alive. And if the Germans returned at dawn, the nightmare would begin again. So Michael closed his eyes, pressed his arms tightly against his body to preserve heat, and waited for sunrise. He did not yet know there would be 3 of them. The next morning arrived gray and merciless. Michael had not slept. He had spent the entire night on his back, teeth clenched to stop them from chattering. The cold no longer felt like weather. It felt conscious, searching for openings in his clothing, draining warmth from his limbs inch by inch. By midnight he had stopped feeling his feet altogether. When daylight finally returned, he cautiously turned his head. The field looked even worse in daylight. Now he could see the dead clearly. Some looked as though they had simply tripped and fallen. Others had been twisted into unnatural positions by explosions. One soldier remained frozen on one elbow, as if he had almost managed to stand before death caught him. Michael stared at them and thought only one thing. They're dead. I'm not. Not yet. Then he heard an engine approaching. Immediately he closed his eyes and became motionless again. A vehicle passed somewhere in the distance without stopping. That was how the second day began. By noon the thirst arrived. Not ordinary thirst. Something deeper. His mouth dried until swallowing became painful. His tongue felt swollen and rough. Snow lay inches from his hand, but touching it might expose him if another patrol appeared nearby. Earlier that morning he had seen German soldiers walking along the edge of the battlefield. The area was still occupied. So he waited. Around midday a cold drizzle began falling from the sky. Michael slowly opened his mouth without lifting his head, letting raindrops fall onto his tongue. It was humiliating. A grown man lying among corpses, drinking rain like an animal. But it kept him alive. The rain lasted only 20 minutes. Still, it gave him enough moisture to think clearly again. Another small victory. By afternoon he noticed the smell. At first he didn't recognize it. Then he understood. One of the bodies nearby had begun decomposing. Michael forced his thoughts elsewhere. He pictured the automobile plant where he had worked before the war. Oil. Hot metal. Factory whistles in the morning. Those memories felt distant and unreal, yet they reminded him another world still existed somewhere beyond the battlefield. Toward evening a new torture began. Insects crawled across his face. Tiny things. Barely visible. He felt them moving along his neck, his lips, his cheeks. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to brush them away. He didn't. That may have been harder than the hunger, the cold, or even the fear of death. Fighting your own body while it begs you to perform one simple movement. But he endured that too. During the second night, Michael finally allowed himself to think about escape. Not immediately. He knew he was too weak. 2 days without food or proper water had turned his muscles stiff and useless. His injured leg barely worked. If he tried to run, he would collapse within yards. Still, he thought like a soldier. The Germans searched the field in daylight. At night, they stayed away. Night belonged to him. If he survived until the third night, maybe he could crawl east. His unit had attacked from the east. That direction meant the best chance of reaching friendly lines. It was a terrible plan. But it was still a plan. And having one pushed back the darkness gathering inside his head. The third morning began with a sound Michael never expected to hear there. A young voice. A German soldier, barely more than a boy, walked across the field speaking nervously to someone nearby. His voice trembled. The footsteps stopped close to Michael. Then came another sound. Vomiting. The young German had become sick from what he saw around him. For the first time in 3 days, Michael stopped thinking of the enemy as faceless shadows. This boy was terrified too. Human. Miserable. Just another frightened kid trapped in hell. It changed nothing. If the boy discovered Michael alive, he would shoot him without hesitation. That was war. Still, the moment stayed with him. By the middle of the third day, another danger appeared. Not physical. Mental. A quiet thought settled into his mind and refused to leave. What if nobody was coming? What if the battlefield had been abandoned permanently? What if crawling east was only a slower way to die? He examined those thoughts carefully because they were real possibilities. Then he whispered silently to himself. Not yet. He was still alive. He still had a plan. He had not exhausted every chance. It wasn't courage. Just logic. Giving up could wait. Late that afternoon, the battlefield changed. At first he sensed it rather than understood it. Engines that had rumbled faintly in the distance for days were suddenly gone. German voices vanished. Silence remained. He waited. 1 hour. Then 2. Nothing. Carefully he turned his head. The field was empty. No soldiers anywhere. Only bodies, wind, and gray sky. Something had shifted. Maybe the Germans had withdrawn to another sector. Michael didn't know why. He only knew the opportunity had arrived. Slowly he bent his injured leg. Pain shot through him, but the leg moved. Then he rolled onto his side for the first time in 3 days. The effort nearly broke him. But he succeeded. For the first time since the battle, he breathed deeply into his lungs and looked toward the darkening horizon. 3 days. He had survived 3 days on that frozen field. Now came the next step. He crawled for 40 minutes. That doesn't sound long until you imagine dragging yourself across frozen ground with a wounded leg after 3 days without food. Every movement became a calculation. Right elbow forward. Left elbow. Push with the good leg. Pause. Breathe. Ice cracked softly beneath him whenever his elbows pressed into the earth. Each sound made him freeze and listen. Nothing. Continue. The pain in his leg became constant, dull and crushing, like metal squeezing muscle endlessly. Eventually he learned to breathe in rhythm with it. Night helped him by hiding him. Night hurt him because he could barely see. He navigated using the stars. His father had once shown him how to find east from the North Star during camping trips when he was a kid. Now that childhood memory guided him through a battlefield. After about an hour, he reached another body. A German soldier. Young. Well supplied. Michael searched him quickly. A canteen hung from the man's belt. Water. Real water. Michael forced himself to drink slowly. His empty stomach might reject too much too fast. In the dead soldier's pocket he found bread, hard as stone. He ate it anyway. The taste felt almost unfamiliar, as though he had forgotten food existed. Then he kept crawling. Half an hour later he heard voices again. Instantly he flattened himself against the ground. 2 men speaking quietly somewhere ahead. English. Michael closed his eyes. For several seconds he simply listened to his own language. Then, for the first time in 3 days, he spoke. Don't shoot. The voices stopped. Someone moved quickly through the darkness. A flashlight beam struck his face. Who are you? Sergeant Michael Turner. 1st Company. 3rd Battalion. How long were you out there? 3 days. A pause followed. You're alive? Still am. 2 scouts dragged him back toward Allied lines. One supported his shoulders while the other lifted his injured leg carefully. Michael offered no help. He had no strength left. He simply stared upward at the night sky moving above him. The dugout smelled of damp earth, tobacco smoke, and hot food. It was the most comforting smell he had ever known. They laid him onto a bunk while a medic unwrapped his coat and examined the wound. Shrapnel's deep, the medic muttered. But the bone's intact. Lucky bastard. Michael said nothing. A young lieutenant from the reconnaissance unit crouched beside him. You really stayed out there 3 days? Michael nodded weakly. The Germans pulled out yesterday evening, the lieutenant said. We came to check for survivors. I knew they were gone, Michael answered quietly. How? It got quiet. The lieutenant looked at him strangely. Not pity. Not admiration either. Something in between. The expression of a man imagining whether he himself could have survived the same thing. Get some sleep, he finally said. But Michael couldn't. Even warm, fed, and safe, his body refused to relax. For 3 days every muscle had existed in a state of absolute tension. That kind of alertness doesn't disappear instantly. He lay awake thinking about Tommy. Tommy, who joked before the assault and talked about opening a diner after the war. Tommy died in the first 10 minutes. Michael survived 3 days. There was no fairness in that. No logic. No explanation worth speaking aloud. Eventually he stopped trying to understand. The next morning they moved him to a medical station. Doctors removed the shrapnel from his leg. One older physician wearing steel-rimmed glasses asked him quietly, "How did you keep from breaking?" Michael thought for a moment. "I kept thinking about my mother's stove back home." The doctor studied him silently, then nodded and returned to his paperwork. After the operation, Michael slept for 14 straight hours. Later they transferred him to a rear hospital set up inside an abandoned schoolhouse. Rows of beds filled old classrooms. A faded map of the United States still hung on one hallway wall. Michael stopped beside it one day and stared. Somewhere on that enormous map was a tiny frozen battlefield no one would ever notice. For weeks he struggled to sleep normally. Every creaking floorboard sounded dangerous. Every cough in the hallway made his body tense automatically. A nurse named Margaret changed his bandages each morning and always told him the same thing. Healing well. Eventually he believed her. An intelligence officer questioned him about the battlefield, the Germans, and how he survived unnoticed for 3 days. Michael answered simply and truthfully. "I didn't move." That answer seemed to disturb the officer more than anything else. After 2 weeks Michael could walk again without crutches. One afternoon he stood by a hospital window looking outside at bare trees and muddy roads. Ordinary things. 3 weeks earlier he had believed he might never see ordinary things again. That realization was enough. Near the end of November, orders arrived sending him back to active duty. Before departure, the hospital commander invited him in for tea. "I read your file," the major said. "Cases like yours are rare." Michael remained silent. Most men wouldn't last 3 days like that. Not because they're cowards. Human beings simply aren't built for it. He paused. "How are you now?" Michael considered the question carefully. "I still sleep badly." "That part usually improves," the major replied softly. "Other things don't." Michael already understood. Something inside him had changed permanently on that field. Not broken. Changed. Like metal after passing through extreme heat. On the morning he left the hospital, Michael stood outside watching the sunrise. The cold November air felt almost identical to the air from the battlefield. But now he stood on his own feet. He asked Margaret for paper and wrote a letter home to his mother. Short and simple. He told her he was alive. Wounded, but recovering. Returning to his unit soon. Then he added one more sentence. He told her that during those 3 days, the thing he thought about most was the warmth of her stove back home. At first he crossed the sentence out. Then he wrote it again. 3 hours later, a truck carried him east toward the front line once more. Michael sat against the side panel watching the road disappear behind them. He had no idea what waited ahead. Nobody did. That was war. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty now. As long as you keep moving, you're alive. As long as you keep thinking, you're alive. And sometimes, to survive, you must learn how to stop looking alive for a little while. It was a lesson bought with 3 frozen days on a battlefield between the Don and the Volga. He carried it with him for the rest of his life.